There is a moment, almost always a silent one, when a woman pauses before her own life and feels that something does not fit. It is not a visible crisis. There is no breakup, no scandal, no date marking a before and after. It is something more subtle. It is the sensation, after having built an entire existence around what was expected of her, rather than around who she truly is, that something is amiss. You know that moment. Perhaps you don't remember it as an event, but rather as a texture. An ordinary afternoon, washing the dishes, glancing at your phone, gazing at the scenery through the car window while stopped at a red light, and then, suddenly, without warning, a question that asked no permission to arrive. Is this my life, or is it the life I learned to want? Most women ask themselves this question at least once. Very few stay with it long enough to let it transform them, because the first thing the mind does with a question like that is shut it off. Look for a quick explanation. Tiredness, stress, not enough sleep, I need a vacation, I need to get more organized. And with that, the question gets tucked away again, the way you tuck away a letter you're afraid to open. Jung would have said that this instant is not a psychological failure, it's a summons. In different contexts, he called it the encounter with the shadow, everything we've set apart from our conscious identity because it didn't fit the version of ourselves the world accepted more easily. For many women, that shadow isn't made of darkness or malice, as it's often imagined. It's made of desire, of ambition, of legitimate anger, of a no that was never spoken, of a voice of her own that was silenced, not by anyone's particular cruelty, but by an invisible consensus about what a woman had to be in order to be loved, accepted, safe. And here the first layer of this story emerges, the most visible one, the one almost everyone manages to see, realizing that one has lived for others, for one's father's gaze, for a partner's approval, for the image projected to one's children, to avoid disappointing anyone. That layer is painful, yet it also brings relief, because it finally has a name, and when something has a name, it seems manageable. It feels like the light at the end of the tunnel. But it isn't. Because beneath that first revelation, I've lived to please, there's a more uncomfortable question, one almost no one dares to fully put into words. And if, even now that I know this, I still don't know who I am when no one is watching, that is where most people stop. They stop because that second question offers no comfort in the form of a clear answer. The first stage of awakening has a villain, family, culture, a partner, the system. The second stage has no one to blame. It has only a mirror. And standing before such a mirror, with no one else to point a finger at, something within the body resists. For while knowing you were shaped by others is painful, knowing that you must now shape yourself without the map others drew for you throughout your life is painful in a different way. It is that freedom which, as no one warned you, also carries a weight. Many women mistake this second layer for having reached the end of the road. They leave a relationship, change jobs, move to another city, cut their hair, start saying no more often, and they feel, genuinely, that they have awakened. And, in a certain sense, it's true, but it's only half true, because there is a third layer, a deeper one that is rarely mentioned in self-help books, since it offers no immediate satisfaction of an external transformation. That layer has nothing to do with what you leave behind. It has to do with what you are willing to carry, on your own, once there is no one left to blame for how you feel. The third layer begins the moment you stop asking what happened to you and start asking what you keep doing to yourself, quietly, without anyone forcing you to. Think of the mornings when you already know how the day will unfold before it starts. The version of you that shows up at work, calm, capable, agreeable. The version that shows up with your mother, patient, understanding, careful not to bring up the old wound again. The version that shows up in the mirror, evaluating, correcting, never quite satisfied. None of these versions are lies exactly. They're smaller than you, and you've grown so used to living inside them that Stepping outside them, even for a moment, feels like stepping into thin air. This is the part of the awakening no one warns you about, the discovery that freedom does not arrive as a feeling, it arrives as a discomfort. Because once you can no longer blame your mother, your culture, your marriage, your history, the question turns inward with nowhere left to hide. And that question is brutally simple. If nothing outside me is keeping me small anymore, why do I still feel small? Jung called this the encounter with the anima and animus in reverse. Not the moment a woman integrates the masculine principle within her, as it's often summarized, but the moment she realizes how much of her inner authority she outsourced to men, to fathers, to institutions, to the idea of a rescuer. Not because she was weak, because somewhere, very early, she learned that being taken care of was safer than being fully seen, and what was learned early is rarely undone by insight alone. It has to be undone by practice, by repetition, by choosing differently in the exact moments the old pattern would have won. This is most clearly perceived in the small decisions that no one else will ever notice. That apology that slips from your lips before you've even finished your sentence, for something that required no apology at all. The way you soften an opinion before anyone can object, just in case. The way you check, almost instinctively, whether the people around you still like you. These are not weaknesses. They are the result of a very ancient pact. Stay likable, stay connected, stay safe. And this is where the story is often told wrong, because most accounts of a woman's awakening end with defiance, burning away what no longer fits. That defiance is real, it matters, and it is often necessary. Yet defiance remains a relationship with what came before. It is still defined by what she refuses. It is not yet freedom, it is rebellion, and rebellion, however satisfying, remains tethered to the very thing it rebels against. The final stage, the one hardly anyone reaches, is quieter than the challenge itself. It needs no witnesses. It is the moment when a woman no longer needs the old wound to explain her decisions, not because the wound wasn't real, but because she has finally built something within herself that does not require that wound as a foundation. This is where Jung's idea of individuation becomes less a theory and more an ache you recognize in your own chest. Individuation, he said, is not becoming someone new. It is becoming who you already were beneath the adaptations. And adaptations, however painful, were never enemies. They were survival. They got you here. The tragedy is not that you built them. The tragedy is mistaking them forever for the whole of who you are. But here the difficulty deepens, because this final stage asks for something almost nobody wants to hear when they're mid-awakening, flush with the relief of finally seeing clearly. It asks you to stop performing your own transformation, because somewhere along the way, the awakening itself can become another costume. You start narrating your own growth. You start explaining, to yourself and to others, how far you've come, how much you've healed, how different you are now. And there is nothing false in that story. But notice, if you're honest, how much of it is still performed for an audience, even when the only audience left is the version of you watching from outside, grading your own progress the way you once let others grade it. This is the quiet trap of self-awareness. It gives you language for your wounds, and language feels like mastery. You can now name the pattern. You can say, I do this because of what happened when I was 9. I attract this because of what I learned from my mother. I struggle with this because no one taught me otherwise. All of it may be true, and yet notice what happens the moment naming becomes its own identity. The wound stops being something you're healing and becomes something you're maintaining, because it has finally given you a coherent story about yourself. And a coherent story, even a painful one, is strangely comforting. It's easier to live inside an explanation than inside the unknown. You feel this most on the days when nothing is wrong. No conflict to manage, no old pattern being triggered, no mirror throwing a hard truth back at you. Just an ordinary afternoon, and a strange, low-grade restlessness underneath it, as if you don't quite know how to exist without something to work through, as if peace itself feels unfamiliar, almost suspicious, like a room you were never given the key to. This is the real threshold, not the moment you understand your wounds, the moment you're no longer organized by them. Jung wrote about the self, not the ego, not the identity built from memory and reaction, but a deeper center that exists prior to any story told about it. Reaching toward that self, he suggested, is not a single dramatic event. It is not the tearful realization in a therapist's office, however real and necessary that realization might be. It is thousands of unremarkable moments in which a woman chooses her own center over the old, automatic pull toward performance, appeasement, or even righteous rebellion. It is choosing rest when productivity used to be her worth. It is choosing silence when defending herself used to be her safety. It is choosing to stay ordinary, unnarrated, unwitnessed, in a moment that used to require an audience to feel real. And this is precisely why so few reach this final layer. Not because it demands more suffering, because it demands less drama. At the exact moment drama has become comfortable, it asks a woman to lay down not only the roles imposed on her, but the identity she built out of surviving them. And laying down an identity, even a hard-won one, can feel disturbingly close to disappearing. You might wonder then, if this isn't a kind of loss. And the honest answer is, yes, it is. Every true threshold demands the death of something that came before it, even when what came before was a form of strength. The woman who fought to break her silence must, in time, stop making that struggle her primary language. The woman who anchored her worth in independence must eventually let go of the need to prove she needs no one. Not because independence was a bad thing, but because it was a stage in her life, not a destination. What waits on the other side of that loss is something Jung rarely described in triumphant terms, because it isn't triumphant. It's steadier than that. He called it, at times, wholeness. Not the erasure of the wounded parts, not their defeat, but their inclusion into something larger than any single one of them. The frightened girl who needed approval, the furious woman who finally said no, the exhausted caretaker, the rebel who burned the house down to breathe. None of them disappear. They stop running the show alone, and this is the part almost no map prepares you for, because it isn't loud enough to make a good story. Because fulfillment doesn't feel like an arrival. At first, it feels like almost nothing at all. There are no fanfares. Nor is there that moment in front of the mirror where you finally recognize your true self, illuminated from within and at peace. Instead, there is a Tuesday, just an ordinary Tuesday when you realize you haven't been performing for anyone, haven't apologized for a feeling that required no apology, and haven't needed the day to prove anything about who you've become. And it almost slips past you unnoticed, because it doesn't announce itself the way pain always did. This is the strange irony Jung kept circling back to. The ego, which spent a lifetime building an identity out of struggle, is rarely equipped to recognize peace when it finally arrives, because peace has no narrative tension to hold on to. Suffering had a plot. Wholeness doesn't need one. So the final stage isn't a place you arrive and stay forever, immune to relapse. It isn't a permanent state you earn once and keep like a trophy. It's more like a frequency you return to, again and again, each time a little faster, a little more familiar, a little less afraid of the silence that comes when there's no wound left to explain you. Some days the old patterns will still surface. The apology before the sentence, the small performance for a room, the reflex to shrink. That isn't failure. That's the nervous system remembering an old language it spent decades learning. What changes in this final stage is not that the old patterns vanish. What changes is how quickly you notice them, how gently you can set them down, and how little power they hold to define, ever again, who you fundamentally are. This is why the awakening was never really about the marriage you left, or the mother you finally stood up to, or the career you rebuilt from nothing. Those were real, and they mattered, and they were often necessary steps, but they were the visible chapters of a much quieter story happening underneath. A woman slowly stopping the outsourcing of her own authority to men, to culture, to the story of her own wounding, and slowly, unglamorously, becoming the authority herself. Most women never reach this final layer because no one ever told them it existed. They were taught that healing has an end, that one day you become whole and the search ceases. Yet what Jung pointed to was something less tidy and more honest, that wholeness does not consist of the absence of your wounded parts. It is the moment you stop needing them to drive your story and simply begin allowing them to belong to you, quietly, without apology, without artifice, and without an audience to convince. And maybe that's the real ending to this. Not a triumphant one, but a mature one. Not the woman who finally proved something, the woman who no longer needs to, the one who can sit in an ordinary room on an ordinary day and simply exist without narrating who she used to be or defending who she's becoming, just there, whole, unwatched, and for the first time entirely her own.